January 29th, 1945. Holzheim, Belgium. 2:47 p.m. First Sergeant Leonard Funk of Company C, 1st Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, rounded the corner of a bullet-pocked Belgian farmhouse, and the breath froze in his lungs. The scene before him was a tableau of his worst nightmare, materialized in the stark, snow-choked air of the Ardennes winter. 90 German soldiers filled the farmyard, a sea of field gray and white camouflage smocks against the dirty snow. Half were already armed, weapons in hand. The other half were hurriedly snatching rifles from a piled cache on the frozen ground. In the center of this teeming mass, 4 American GIs, his men, knelt with their hands laced behind their heads, faces pale masks of resignation and terror. These were the same Germans his company had captured just 20 minutes prior during the brutal house-by-house assault to seize the village. With the rest of Company C still engaged in mopping up scattered resistance, he could only spare 4 guards for the 80 prisoners. Now those prisoners were free, rearming with chilling efficiency and organizing to launch a devastating attack into the rear of his scattered, vulnerable company. A German officer, his face sharp and furious beneath the rim of his Stahlhelm, broke from the crowd. He strode directly toward Funk, an MP-40 submachine gun held low. Without breaking stride, he drove the muzzle hard into the paratrooper's stomach, the cold metal biting through Funk's wool layers. The officer's words were a guttural, venomous bark. Ergeben Sie sich, Waffe fallen lassen. Surrender, drop your weapon. Funk didn't speak German, neither did any of the Americans. The officer, his face flushing crimson with rage and urgency, screamed the command again, louder, spit flying from his lips. The 90 pairs of enemy eyes were locked on him. The 4 kneeling Americans watched, helpless. The math was incontrovertible, the outcome preordained, 90-1. Surrender or be obliterated where he stood. Leonard Funk looked at the gun in his gut. He looked at the sea of enemy soldiers. He looked at his doomed men. And then he did the one thing no one in that frozen yard could have possibly predicted. He started to laugh. It began as a low chuckle, a rumble in his chest that fought past the pressure of the gun barrel. Then it grew, shaking his shoulders, a genuine, deep-seated laugh that echoed in the sudden, stunned silence of the farmyard. The German officer's face twisted, first in utter confusion, then in incandescent rage. He screamed again, the words meaningless to Funk, but the intent clear as crystal. Funk laughed harder, bending slightly at the waist as if sharing a private joke with the universe. In that bizarre, suspended moment of confusion he had created, Leonard Funk made his decision. He remembered the frozen, contorted bodies in a field near Normandy. He remembered his vow, and he acted. What transpired in the next 60 seconds was a blur of violence so audacious, so perfectly executed, it would defy belief had it not been witnessed by multiple survivors and etched into official citations. When the last echo of gunfire faded, 21 German soldiers lay dead or dying in the snow. 24 more were wounded. The remaining 40-odd, their will shattered by the sheer, insane ferocity of the counterattack, threw down their weapons and surrendered for the second time that day. All because a 5'5", 140-pound paratrooper from Pennsylvania, with a gun pressed to his stomach, decided to laugh. This is the story of Leonard Alfred Jr. Funk, the most decorated American paratrooper of World War II, a man whose journey from steel-town clerk to legend encapsulates the brutal chaos of airborne warfare, the resilience of the human spirit, and the extraordinary world-altering courage that can erupt in a single, decisive minute. Part 1. The Forging, from Braddock to the Airborne. Funk's story begins not in the snows of Belgium, but in the soot and smoke of industrial Pennsylvania.
He was born on August 27, 1916, in Braddock Township, a community defined by the colossal steel mills that lined the Monongahela River 8 miles east of Pittsburgh. It was a world of grit, noise, and hard labor, where men earned their living by the sweat of their brow, and responsibility was learned young. The Great Depression, grinding through its 5th year as Funk graduated from high school in 1934, crushed such towns, turning scarcity into a way of life. College was an unreachable dream, a steady job, a fantasy. Funk, who had already shouldered the care of his younger brother for years, understood duty and perseverance long before he ever donned a uniform. When Congress extended the draft in June 1941, with Europe and Asia engulfed in war, Funk's number came up. He reported to the induction center at Wilmerding, Pennsylvania. At 24 years old, standing 5'5" and weighing 140 pounds, he was not the physical archetype of a soldier. The Army physical examiner likely pegged him for clerical duty, a safe rear echelon assignment. They could not have been more wrong. Funk volunteered for the paratroopers. In 1941, the American Airborne was a radical, untested concept. The idea of jumping from perfectly good airplanes into darkness behind enemy lines, intentionally landing amidst hostile forces to fight while surrounded, struck most soldiers as a form of institutionalized suicide. The volunteers who stepped forward were self-selected outliers, men drawn to the challenge, the extra pay, jump pay, and the elite status. They had to be a different breed, for the training was designed to break the average man. The regimen at places like Fort Benning's jump school was a 5-week gauntlet of relentless physical and psychological pressure. There were endless runs in full gear, obstacle courses, tumbling drills, and the dreaded mass kicks designed to instill aggressiveness. The drop tower simulated the stomach-lurching sensation of a parachute opening. Finally came the aircraft itself, the roaring C-47 Dakota. The first jump was a primal test of will. Stepping out into the 120-mile-per-hour slipstream at 1,200 feet, trusting your life to silk canopy and shroud lines, required a leap of faith that went beyond the physical. Funk mastered it. He earned his coveted silver jump wings, a badge of honor that marked him as part of a new brotherhood of warriors.
Assigned to Company C, 1st Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Funk shipped to England with his unit in late 1943. There, the 508th was attached to the legendary 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans, already veterans of bloody combat in Sicily and Italy. Funk, at 27, was an old man among his squad mates, most of whom were barely 20, but he possessed something they were still acquiring, a settled maturity, a quiet, unflappable competence. He was not a loud or boastful leader. He led by steady example, by a calm assurance that inspired trust. By the time the Allies finalized plans for the invasion of Normandy, Funk had risen to squad leader. He was ready for his first test under fire, a test that would come in the chaotic skies and hedgerows of occupied France. Part 2, Baptism by Fire, Normandy, and the leader emerges. The roar of the C-47's engines was a constant thunder in Leonard Funk's ears on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944. Packed into the vibrating fuselage with the rest of his stick, each man burdened with nearly 100 pounds of weapons, ammunition, and equipment, he felt the aircraft shudder as German anti-aircraft fire, flak, began to explode around them in ugly black puffs. Tracers, like angry orange fireflies, arced up through the darkness. This was not the planned drop. Intense flak and confusion caused pilots to scatter, climb, and dive, breaking formation. The green light flashed. The jumpmaster yelled, "Go!" One by one, the paratroopers hurled themselves into the void. Funk landed hard in the pitch-black Norman countryside, miles from his intended drop zone. The impact wrenched his ankle badly, a severe sprain, possibly a fracture.
Agony shot up his leg. All around him was the sound of distant gunfire, shouts in German and English, and the disorienting silence of a countryside that was suddenly a battlefield. He was alone, injured, and deep inside enemy-held territory. This moment defined Leonard Funk. He did not panic. He buried his parachute, assessed his situation, and began to move. His mission was to find his unit, but more immediately to survive and fight. Over the next hours and days, he became a magnet for lost paratroopers, men from different companies, different regiments, all scattered by the chaotic drop. He collected 18 of them. With no officer present, they looked to the steady, older sergeant with the obvious injury for leadership. He gave it to them. For 10 grueling days, First Sergeant Funk led this improvised patrol through the Norman bocage, the dense hedgerow country that was a defender's dream. They moved by night, hid by day, foraged for food, and engaged German patrols when avoidance was impossible. Insisting on taking the point position himself, the most dangerous role, Funk limped ahead on his injured ankle, scouting every lane and crossing. His calm demeanor and clear decisions held the group together. They had no radio, no resupply, no certainty. They had only Funk's leadership. By the time the Allies finalized plans for the invasion of Normandy, Funk had risen to squad leader. He was ready for his first test under fire, a test that would come in the chaotic skies and hedgerows of occupied France. Part 3, A Bridge Too Far and the Distinguished Service Cross. After the grueling campaign in Normandy, the 82nd was pulled back to England to refit and prepare for its next, even more ambitious mission, Operation Martin Garden. Conceived by Field Marshal Montgomery, it was the largest airborne operation in history. The plan was to drop 3 airborne divisions, the American 82nd and 101st and the British 1st, along a single highway in the Netherlands to seize a series of bridges, culminating at Arnhem over the Rhine. Ground forces would then race up this carpet of airborne-held crossings, outflanking the German Siegfried Line and potentially ending the war by Christmas. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity. On September 17, 1944, Funk jumped again into combat, this time over the Dutch countryside near Nijmegen. The 508th's objectives were key bridges around the city. While the larger operation would ultimately become famous as A Bridge Too Far, doomed by underestimated German resistance and slow ground advance, Funk's war was fought on a smaller, immediate scale. After securing his company's initial objectives, Funk's attention was drawn to a threat not on the maps. He spotted 3 German 20mm Flak 38 anti-aircraft guns cleverly dug in on high ground near the village of Weiler. These guns were not firing at high-flying bombers. They were leveled to fire horizontally, raking the sky at wave after wave of Allied gliders. These gliders carried the reinforcements, heavy weapons, jeeps, and command elements critical to the airborne forces' survival. Each glider was a slow, unarmed, and fragile target. The position was heavily defended by an estimated 20 German soldiers, protected by sandbags and with interlocking fields of fire. Standard infantry doctrine demanded at least a 3-to-1 attacker's advantage to assault a prepared position. Leonard Funk had 3 men besides himself. He was outnumbered roughly 7-to-1. He gave the order to attack. Leading from the absolute front, Funk and his tiny patrol advanced under fire. Using what cover they could find, they closed with the position in a sudden, violent assault. Their ferocity and shock tactics overwhelmed the German security detachment. Funk and his men stormed the gun pits, neutralizing the crews and silencing all 3 lethal weapons. The glider stream flew on, unmolested.
For this act of spectacular bravery and tactical brilliance, single-handedly, with his small team, eliminating a dire threat to the entire operation while vastly outnumbered, Leonard Funk was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, DSC, the nation's second highest military award, just below the Medal of Honor. He now held the Silver Star and the DSC, two of the rarest combat decorations in the U.S. military. Most soldiers who earned one are considered legendary. Funk had two, and still his defining moment lay ahead in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. Part 4. The Bulge, Normandy, and a Vow. In December 1944, with the Allied advance stalled at the German border, Adolf Hitler launched his last desperate gamble in the West, Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. 3 German armies, including elite SS Panzer divisions, smashed through the thinly held, forested Ardennes sector in Belgium and Luxembourg. Their goal was to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The initial attack achieved complete surprise, creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines and plunging the front into chaos. This was the Battle of the Bulge. The conditions were apocalyptic: deep snow, temperatures plunging to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, blizzards that blinded men and grounded aircraft. Weapons froze, men died of exposure in their foxholes. Into this maelstrom, the 82nd Airborne was rushed piecemeal to hold critical road junctions and blunt the German spearhead. Then came the news from Normandy. On December 17th, the second day of the offensive, a convoy of American artillery observers from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was captured by Kampfgruppe Piper, an SS armored battle group. Approximately 113 American prisoners were herded into a snow-covered field near the Bagnères crossroads. Without warning, SS troops opened fire on them with machine guns and pistols. Men were cut down as they tried to run. The wounded were executed with shots to the head. 84 Americans were massacred. A handful survived by playing dead among the corpses. The Normandy massacre sent a seismic shock through the American army. The unspoken, professional rules of warfare in the European theater, grim but generally adhered to, were incinerated in that field. For Leonard Funk and thousands of others, the war changed in that instant. This was no longer a conflict against a professional military foe. It was a fight against an ideology capable of barbarism. The abstract concept of the enemy became painfully, personally visceral. Funk, already a veteran of Normandy and Holland, had seen friends die and endured the horrors of combat, but Normandy was different. It was calculated, cold-blooded murder. It erased any thought of honorable surrender to units like the SS. In the frozen silence of the Ardennes forest, Leonard Funk made a quiet, irrevocable decision. He would never surrender to the Germans, no matter the odds, no matter the circumstance. That decision, forged in cold fury, would be tested to its absolute limit just over a month later. Part 5. Holzheim, the impossible calculus. By late January 1945, the German offensive had been broken, its spearheads blunted and destroyed. The Allies were now on the offensive, pushing the Germans back through the Ardennes and into the Reich itself. On January 29th, Company C of the 508th Infantry Regiment received orders to assault and capture the small Belgian village of Holzheim. The company was a shadow of its former self. It was under strength, exhausted from weeks of combat in the Bulge, and its executive officer had recently been killed. First Sergeant Leonard Funk was now the acting company executive officer, the second in command. He walked into the company headquarters tent. Inside were the clerks, the cooks, the supply sergeants, the radio operators, the men who kept the machine running but rarely saw the sharp end of combat. "You're all infantry now," he told them. "Grab your weapons. We're taking that village."
He fashioned this ad hoc collection of desk jockeys and support troops into a makeshift platoon. Few had recent combat experience. They were clerks, not killers. But Funk needed bodies, and he would provide the leadership. They marched 15 miles through waist-deep snow in a driving blizzard under sporadic German artillery fire to reach Holzheim. Funk led from the front, as always. The assault was a testament to his leadership. He organized the men, directed their fire, and led them in clearing the village house by house. His makeshift warriors performed beyond all expectation. They cleared 15 houses of German defenders, capturing 30 prisoners in the process. Another American unit captured 50 more on the village's far side. By early afternoon, 80 German prisoners were corralled in the walled yard of a large farmhouse. The fighting was not over, however. Sporadic resistance continued in other parts of Holzheim. Funk, needing every rifle to maintain momentum and security, faced a commander's cruel dilemma. He could only spare 4 men to guard the 80 prisoners. "Keep them here," he told the 4 guards. "We'll send reinforcements when we can." It was a risk, but war is a calculus of risks. Then he turned and led the rest of his men back into the fight to finish clearing the village. It was the opening the enemy needed. While Funk was engaged elsewhere, a German patrol, perhaps 10 to 20 men from a unit still resisting in the area, approached the farmhouse. Dressed in white winter camouflage capes, they were nearly invisible in the blizzard. In the confusion, they may have even been mistaken for American troops in similar snow gear. They overwhelmed the 4 guards before a shot could be fired, disarmed them, and forced them to their knees in the snow. Then they freed the 80 prisoners. In minutes, the dynamic in the farmyard flipped. 80 prisoners, now joined by their liberators, became a force of 90 battle-hardened German soldiers. They seized the stacked American weapons and began to organize with chilling efficiency. Their plan was obvious and devastating. They would form up and attack Company C from the rear, while the Americans were still scattered and focused forward. If they succeeded, it would be a massacre. It was at this precise moment that First Sergeant Leonard Funk, his sector of the village secure, walked back around the corner of the farmhouse to check on the prisoners. Part 6, 60 Seconds of Immortality. The scene that greeted Funk was so surreal, so catastrophically wrong, that for a split second his brain must have refused to process it. His 4 men were on their knees. The yard was a swarm of active, armed German soldiers. The pile of captured weapons was gone. The German officer in charge immediately spotted Funk's sergeant stripes and recognized a leader. He strode forward, the embodiment of sudden reversed fortune. He shoved the muzzle of his MP-40 hard into Funk's abdomen. "Ergeben sich," he screamed. Funk did not understand the words. He only understood the gun, the anger, and the 90 enemies now staring at him. The officer screamed again, louder, his face purpling. Every rational calculation, every instinct of self-preservation screamed one thing: surrender. The odds were 90 to 1. His men were already captured. Resistance was suicide. Then he thought of Malmedy. He thought of the 84 men in the snow. He remembered his vow. And so Leonard Funk laughed. It was not a hysterical cackle, nor a forced guffaw. Witnesses described it as a real, deep, shoulder-shaking laugh, as if he had just heard the most absurd joke in the world. The effect on the German officer was instantaneous and paralyzing. This was not in the script. Prisoners begged, pleaded, shook with fear. They did not stand there laughing while a submachine gun was drilled into their stomach. For 3, 4, 5 critical seconds, the officer was utterly confused and thrown off balance. His men, too, watched in bewildered silence. Funk, still appearing to be overcome with mirth, slowly, deliberately moved his right hand up toward his shoulder. Slung there was his M1A1 Thompson submachine gun, the signature weapon of American paratroopers. The German officer watched the movement. Good, he must have thought. The fool is finally complying. He's unslinging his weapon to surrender it. Funk's hand closed on the Thompson's pistol grip. In one continuous, lightning-fast motion, honed with thousands of repetitions, he unslung the weapon, swung it down, and brought the muzzle to bear on the officer's chest, all in the space of a heartbeat. He squeezed the trigger. The Thompson roared to life, its .45 caliber rounds tearing into the officer's torso at a rate of over 600 rounds per minute. The burst stitched across his torso, killing him instantly. The spell of confusion shattered into a storm of violence. Funk pivoted, still firing, hosing a deadly arc of fire into the closest clusters of German soldiers. The shock was total. Men screamed and fell. "Pick up their weapons," Funk bellowed to his 4 guards. They scrambled forward, snatching rifles from the hands of the dead and dying. Funk's first 30-round magazine emptied in seconds. This was the most vulnerable moment, the 2 seconds it took to reload. But his training was absolute. In a fluid motion, he ejected the spent magazine, slammed a new one home, racked the bolt, and resumed firing, all while continuing to shout commands and move.
21 German soldiers lay dead in the churned, crimson-stained snow. 24 more were wounded. The remaining 40-odd, their brief taste of freedom extinguished, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender once more. The prisoners were prisoners again. Funk stood amid the carnage, smoke curling from the barrel of his Thompson. He looked at the scene, at his men now rearmed and in control. His reported comment was a masterpiece of understatement. That, he said, was the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Part 7. The Medal of Honor and the Weight of Legend. The story of Holzheim raced through the 82nd Airborne like wildfire. The paperwork for a Medal of Honor recommendation began almost immediately. There was no dispute, no need for embellishment. The facts spoke for themselves. Outnumbered 90-1, a gun to his stomach, facing certain death or captivity, he had chosen to attack and had won. On September 5, 1945, at the White House, President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Leonard Funk's neck. The citation read, in part, "He was ordered to surrender by a German officer who pushed a machine pistol into his stomach. Although overwhelmingly outnumbered and facing almost certain death, First Sergeant Funk, pretending to comply with the order, began slowly to unsling his submachine gun from his shoulder. Then, with a lightning motion, he brought the muzzle into line and riddled the German officer. He turned upon the other Germans, firing and shouting to the other Americans to seize the enemy's weapons. President Truman, looking at the unassuming sergeant before him, famously said, "I would rather have this medal than be President of the United States." Leonard Funk's tally of valor was and remains unparalleled for an American paratrooper. Medal of Honor, Holzheim. Distinguished Service Cross, Weiler, Holland. Silver Star, Normandy. Bronze Star for meritorious service. Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, wounded 3 times. French Croix de Guerre. Belgian Order of Leopold. Dutch Military Order of William, the Netherlands' highest award, equivalent to the Victoria Cross. He was, by any measure, the most decorated paratrooper of World War II. Part 8. The Quiet Return, a Life of Service. When the parades ended and the headlines faded, Leonard Funk did what many of the greatest citizen soldiers of his generation did. He went home. He returned to Pennsylvania, not to capitalize on his fame with books or lectures, but to build a quiet life. He married his sweetheart, Gertrude, and they raised 2 daughters in McKeesport, a working-class suburb of Pittsburgh. He took a job as a claims examiner with the Veterans Administration. For 27 years, Leonard Funk, Medal of Honor recipient, legend of the 82nd Airborne, sat at a government desk. His mission was now to help his fellow veterans navigate the very bureaucracy he had once fought to preserve. He processed disability claims, cut through red tape, and ensured that the men who had served received the benefits they were owed.
He rose to become division chief of the Pittsburgh Regional Office, respected for his diligence and integrity. His medals, including the pale blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor, were kept in a case at home. He rarely spoke of the war. When pressed about Holzheim, he would shrug and offer the same simple, powerful explanation: "Did what I had to do." For him, the laughter, the violence, the legend, it was all just part of a job that needed doing on a terrible day in January. Epilogue: The Legacy of the Laughing Sergeant. Leonard Alfred Funk, Jr. died of cancer on November 20th, 1992, at the age of 76. He was buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 35, Grave 23734, among the legions of American heroes. At the time of his death, he was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the 82nd Airborne Division in World War II. His name lives on at a fitness center at Fort Liberty, formerly Bragg, on a stretch of Pennsylvania highway, and on a post office dedicated in his honor. His story is more than a tale of spectacular bravery. It is a study in the essence of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than fear. In that farmyard, faced with an impossible calculus, Funk's mind did not fixate on the 90 enemies. It focused on the memory of Malmedy, on the 4 men on their knees, on the scattered comrades who would be slaughtered from behind. Something else became more important than his own fear or survival. His laughter was the catalyst, but the true weapon was his mind, a mind that kept working, kept calculating, kept seeking an advantage when all advantage was gone. War does not always favor the strong, the loud, or the fearless. It often favors the ones who, in the moment of absolute crisis, keep thinking after everyone else has stopped. Leonard Funk's laughter broke the script. It created a pocket of confusion, a sliver of time, and in that sliver he acted with a clarity and violence that changed everything. He reminds us that history is not just shaped by grand strategies and vast armies, but by the split-second decisions of ordinary individuals thrust into extraordinary circumstances. He was a Steel Town clerk who became a paratrooper, a quiet man who became a legend, and a soldier who, when the world narrowed to the muzzle of a gun and the eyes of 90 enemies, chose to laugh, and in doing so, wrote his name into immortality.